Because, I mean, in truth, you could take down every one of those missionaries. He's like, let me show you a little Krav Maga. Okay.
Hello and welcome to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. That's right, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff.
That's right.
Emphasis on the podcast, right? I am your host, Thomas. Guess who I'm looking at? Guess who I'm here with? I'm here with Daniel, as
That's
always,
right.
of course.
And great to be here. Excited about jumping back in this morning. As we begin, we want to thank our patrons who have gone over to patreon.com/reasontogether and committed to support this podcast. And I sure appreciate your investment in what we do. And thank you so much for that. If you're interested in supporting what we do here, feel free to go to patreon.com/reasontogether. We have seen here in recent months kind of bringing it full circle in a way where we've the podcast has grown, and then we added the blog, and then of course in the process we're doing a lot of the background stuff, especially you, Tom, I feel like, and then finally getting to the place where we have a podcast editor and then a blog editor. And maybe probably not being paid everything that they're worth, but at least having somebody on board to take that off our shoulders and to just keep focusing on what we love doing, and that is to talk about these things and to write meaningful blog posts. And so that's great.
Yeah, and the reason we're able to afford hiring said people is all thanks to our patrons who generously give their money to support this podcast. And we'd sure love it if you would consider jumping on board as one as well over at patreon.com/reasontogether.
Now, I'm going to tell you, probably the better part of this episode, and this is really exciting, is going to be feedback. We've had a lot of feedback in the last week.
Yes, we have.
So, and we like to encourage that if you have a thought, you have a question, maybe it's related to something that we've talked about. Some people may be blazing through past episodes. You know, we're up to almost 150 now. You're listening to past shows, or if you're an elite patron, the bonus episodes, you've got several of those. And maybe some of that is triggering some thoughts in your mind or some questions, or it's just something that comes up out of the blue. You're in your day-to-day life, and all of a sudden you say, you know, what about that? And you'd like to hear a discussion about it. And don't think, sometimes you might feel like a question is silly, and it's not necessarily. I think there is such a thing as a silly question, but really there's a lot that we in life need to connect and say, well, how does that fit into the life of a Christian? And how are we supposed to think about that and be balanced? And we would love to entertain that question. So you feel free to send that our way at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, and there is one patron who jumped on board recently who has been getting right after it, going onto the message board and communicating and sending in emails and doing a good job there. That is James McGowan has joined us as a patron of our podcast.
James, welcome. Thank you.
Yes, we appreciate you coming on board.
Now,
all right.
I have to say, before we started, you and I were just in a brief discussion, and about a goatee and a mustache. And I am, and I just, it's not a big deal, but I'm starting to let it grow out here, and I'm certainly less of an Esau and more of a Jacob. So I'm not an hairy man. So it kind of takes a while, but anyway, you kind of maybe comforted me / intrigued me by saying that there actually is a style of goatee called the Shakespearean style, which I Fu Manchu. I'd heard of Fu Manchu, where you sort of connect the mustache into the goatee. But for those who like really just can't grow it there and don't want to do like a comb down, like let it grow for 7 months and then just comb it down. That you actually have a separation there, and it's a Shakespearean style goatee. I think that sounds pretty cool. And it
now,
looks pretty cool
I can't promise you that is in vogue.
But it has a name. It has a title.
It has a thing. Yeah, it's a thing.
And it probably looks better if it's gray. Honestly, I'm just saying, if I think of Shakespeare and I think of this guy like in a robe and this just Shakespearean, to me, he has to be almost older.
I was thinking more jet black, jet black.
Okay.
But you can't really pass it off without a very large hat with a very large feather sticking out of it, and maybe tights that you wouldn't feel comfortable wearing.
Oh yeah, okay. But
Yeah.
that's not required in order to have a
No.
Shakespearean style
And no,
goatee.
and a very puffy shirt.
And speak in thous. And
Yeah.
okay. All right. So there you go. There's your little tidbit for the day. If you didn't know that there's a Shakespearean style goatee, uh, fellas, hey, go for it.
Yeah.
Give it a shot.
See,
You know,
that is what you need to sign up for this podcast for. That is it right there. Gold
the
nuggets, just
the
like that.
the podcast for Christians who think about stuff, and some of
That's
that
right.
stuff happens to be goatees. But anyway,
Right. Sure.
okay.
Hit me with some feedback.
Okay. Well,
Let's get ready to do it.
where to start? I was particularly uh pleased by this one here. I was like, oh man, he started throwing in some scripture. I'm like, oh, there you go. Trying to make connections there, and that's great. He was this is from Matthew, and he was responding to episode 145, and we had talked about, you brought up the question of how people treat their pets.
Yeah.
And
Remind everybody it was me.
Okay, and
Go ahead.
so the one who the evil villain who brought up
Mm-hmm.
the cat hater who brought up the question was, no, I'm just kidding, about pets. Some people seem to will really elevate their pet almost to they're a family member, and they're like human, and they treat, and of course, especially in America, I think you have, with America and money and technology, you have the wherewithal to really pamper your pet. So anyway, we were just kind of discussing that scenario, and how the scripture does say, that we referenced this verse, that a righteous man regardeth the life of his beast. So he's not cruel to his animals. Well, Matthew makes a point. He said, if there is a line we're not supposed to cross in treating animals like humans, the Bible does not make that clear. Interesting. I think God is simply not concerned about that, because no matter how we treat animals, it's impossible to bring them up to a human level. He created them lower. Now, I would say God does care about it, because he just cares about us living wisely and making every decision appropriately. But the way he's saying that there's not a specific verse that says how far to treat your animal nicely, it simply says don't treat them cruelly, essentially.
Yeah.
So, but yes, that God did create them lower. He goes on to say the Bible doesn't say anything about treating your animal too well. It only condemns treating it poorly. He mentions that he has dogs, but he's never going to be called dad by any dog. Some people kind of call their pet their kid, their next kid. But he says he has no problem with people who want to do that. So he thought we had a good discussion going, but he mentions a few passages to consider. This is interesting. 2 Samuel 12:3, when Nathan confronts David about his sin with Bathsheba, Nathan uses an illustration of a little lamb. And he says, and I'm quoting here from the email, not from looking at the scripture, but here it says, I believe it's brought and nourished up. The lamb was brought and nourished up, or bought and nourished up, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own meat and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. Interesting. A lot of people, he says, would consider this treating the lamb like a human. However, it was not weird in that society. The man's attachment to the lamb was just understood. David even defended the man, saying that the rich man who stole it from him should die. Now, he does make the fair point here, and I think this is a good balance. God doesn't specifically condone it, but it was the illustration that God apparently chose to use through the prophet Nathan. Interesting. I wouldn't have remembered that. I didn't, during our discussion, remember that terminology, how in such endearing terms he described that animal in its relationship to the man.
Sure. And to be clear, though, I mean, he mentions it is an illustration.
Yes.
It was a parable. In fact, perhaps the only parable given in the Old Testament. But it is a parable. It's not saying that that was normative for their society. And it's certainly not saying that everyone should treat a pet as if it's their child.
And right.
It's,
and taking
it is for illustrative purposes.
Right. And taking a doctrine from an illustration is pretty sketchy. But
Yeah.
Then he goes on with Luke 14:5, which says, "Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day?" Now he's mentioning that passage in reference to the statement that you, the cruel cat hater, brought out that said, "No, I'm just kidding. If your dog runs out the door or whatever, and he runs away right before church, and then do you miss church to go look for the dog, or do you just, well, we're going to go to church when we get back, we'll deal with the issue." So he says, "I know." What's that?
Go ahead,
He's,
finish reading it.
yeah, this paragraph says, "I know that Sabbath is not the same as church, and Jesus wasn't condoning missing church, but it was just understood that if your animal was in trouble, you were going, I think he means you weren't going to break the Sabbath to help it."
Okay, so what do you see? What do you see as a key difference, though?
The key difference I see is
between that and today, and the illustration I gave.
Yes, I would say the difference is that, to me, the ox is actually in trouble. He's fallen into the pit. He's in a bad situation. Where if my dog runs away, he's running around the streets. Okay, you know what I mean? He's not going to starve to death in the next 3 hours, or whatever. I can go look for him. He's not in danger per se, and he's not hurt. Where the ox fallen into the ditch or into a pit, I don't know. Yeah, I guess you could say, well, just wait 3 hours. But what was
that's not the difference I was thinking.
Okay.
The difference is that was an agrarian society. If your ox or your ass fell in the ditch, that was your money. That was your business. That was like your work.
That's like your car falling in. That's like your tractor falling in the pit.
Well, even worse than your tractor falling in the pit. I mean, this was much of your, I guess, it'd be akin to a tractor falling in the pit. It inhibits your ability to do your work and subsist afterwards because your beast of burden is in a ditch. Whereas a pet is more of a novelty in many ways. It's not how you subsist.
Which even in the case of, say, the lamb with the man in the illustration, in that society, you have to imagine that it never mentions specifically in Scripture that anyone had a pet.
Right.
As we understand pet, that we just have it solely for our pleasure, and it just lives, and then we, prolong its life as long as possible just to give us pleasure. So he loved the lamb, but eventually was he going to kill it and eat it? I don't know. I mean, the illustration doesn't say.
Well,
but
the illustration is mum on that. But I mean, most of the time when we see lambs cared for that preciously in the Old Testament, the purpose was for them to be a sacrifice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then lastly, he mentions in Luke, get your reaction on this. A few verses later, same passage, Luke 14:11-12, Jesus says, "The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep," and that a hireling wouldn't do that. A good shepherd would sacrifice time, comfort, convenience, his resources for his sheep because he loves them. It was understood that a good shepherd would even sacrifice his life for his animal.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is there's still a difference there between pet ownership and what this verse is talking about here.
Yes.
And that's the thing. I want to make sure, and I'm not disagreeing with what Matthew is saying. He's making very good points, but in a sense, it is conflating what we were arguing with a different subject.
Yes.
He's talking about mistreatment of animals of any kind. We're talking about the elevation of novelty beings to an unhealthy degree. That's what we're talking about. In this verse here, a good shepherd giving his life for the sheep, that's his duty. He's been hired to protect the livelihood of someone else. And if he's just there for the paycheck, right? If he's just an hourly employee just there for the paycheck, he's not going to give his life for the sheep. But if he's a worker who actually cares about the job, cares about doing well, he's going to give his life for the sheep, right? But again, this is not the same thing as someone having a novelty pet, right? Sometimes people have livestock. They might have a cow, or they might have a horse that does work, or these other sorts of things. Or they might, I mean, who knows? They could be using them for any number of things. If they can't do what needs to be done at times because they elevate these animals higher than the priorities of life, something is wrong. That's my point.
Yeah.
And another example would be, someone has a small farm, right? But the Lord calls them to the mission field, right? Or he calls them to move somewhere, go somewhere. And they're like, well, no, I don't want to give up these animals, right? They're not doing what needs to be done because they have an emotional attachment to these animals. But someone who realizes the priorities of life, when God calls you, there's something higher. You say, you know what? As much as I'm emotionally attached to these things, I need to do what needs to be done, right?
Yes, and that even animals are not. It may be emotional attachment to something else. Animals just
Right.
tend to really grab our emotions sometimes.
Yes, because they are soul-ish beings, right? To use
Yes,
the Old Testament nephesh, right? They are soulish. They seem animate. They seem lifelike, but they're not human in the same way that we are as
they're
people in the
not.
image of God.
Correct, right. Good.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Matthew's arguments are great if you're talking about the treatment of animals.
Well,
We would never advocate for the gross mistreatment of animals.
right.
What we're saying is the misprioritizing of animals that aren't really for a purpose, that are more for our emotional comfort and novelty, and elevating that to the point where we're unwilling to do
Yeah.
what God expects of us because of an emotional comfort issue.
Yeah. And then his last paragraph here, he's kind of says, I think this whole issue becomes a problem when Christians draw their line and then judge other Christians by where they draw their line. Now, he may have a point here. For example, I was recently talking to a man who described how he dispatched his pets when they got too old. He asked me if talk like this made me uncomfortable and appeared to be watching my response to see if I was a sissy or not. Um, so kind of like I'm going to talk this certain way, and because this is where I've drawn my line, that if you draw a different line than I do, then you're a sissy, or you love animals too much, or you're a whatever. Yes, could that be a problem? Of saying, well, this is how I regard animals, and if you regard them higher or differently than I do, then that's a problem. Well, I think you do have to be careful
Sure.
of judging people by your own perspective of something. And I'm always the guy probably that points to personality, but honestly, there is probably some of that in there. And if your personality is one that's gruff and rough and you're always aggressive, and you look at a guy who's a little bit more reserved and cautious, and you're like, he's just a mamby-pamby because he doesn't, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, that's not a righteous judgment.
Mhm.
Um,
Well,
so
I mean, to be balanced, he might be.
He might be. He
He
might
might
be.
be,
But if it's
but
simply
not always.
he's not like I am, and I am the standard of right, so therefore
Right.
he is wrong. So I
That's
think there
right.
is a point there, and not that I
Yeah,
agree with you.
and this dude dispatching his own pets, for all we know, he's a sadist who just loves violence.
The
Might be a
judgment could go the
sicko.
other way.
Yeah, it certainly could go the other way.
So I agree with what you're saying about, these verses not really applying. However, what I appreciate is drawing in these scriptural thoughts to say, but what about this? How does that apply? The
Absolutely.
Bible talks about an animal there and a man's interaction with this animal. And I just really have to just commend Matthew there and just thank you for the feedback and
Yeah,
trying to make those connections and help feed that discussion. All right. Which one do we want
absolutely.
to hit next?
We have some feedback in our Trello board here. Okay, this one is still on. We actually have two here in the Trello board. This one is from
Okay.
Michael, one of our patrons. He said, long ago, my dad said that we can like dogs, we have dogs, but save our love for people. People
Hmm.
can get too far with how they view their pets. Some houses have a sign that tells the fireman how many pets are in the house. I wouldn't risk a human's life to save an animal's life. It's important to note how much the Lord values each of us, about how much more important we are than many sparrows, and knows
Hmm.
how many hairs, that's a good point, and
Yes,
knows how
that is
many
good.
hairs are on our head, and how he numbers them. Then the biggest proof that he loves us more than any other creation is how he created us in his image and how he died in our place for our sins. He didn't
Absolutely.
do all that for our pets. I think people are too concerned about trying to save the planet and all the animals, but don't bat an eye at the abortion industry and the like.
Ding, ding,
It's
ding, ding,
also,
ding, ding, ding,
yep,
ding.
that's it. It's also interesting to note that John says that our salvation is evidenced by our love for the brethren, not by how we think about animals. All very excellent points. It
Wow, that was
reminded me
great.
of that recent thing they did in California where they actually created a Bill of Rights for dogs and cats, for animals.
Oh my.
They created a Bill of Rights. I'll see if I can find the link to that and include that in the show notes, but that's an actual thing that happened. And yet the abortion industry is still going strong over
Yes.
there.
If there's some of the issues, and particularly that issue is so, what'd you say, clarifying of hypocrisy.
Sure.
When you see this or I would wig out over, the extinction of the sea turtle or whatever, or over the treatment of
Yeah.
a bird in a certain marsh area. But
Or bald eagle eggs.
yes,
Just the eggs.
yeah, but I'm fully behind in funding a woman's choice to kill her child.
Yeah.
I'm fully behind. That if that doesn't tell you that truth doesn't really matter anymore, and that it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to
Yeah.
appeal to my emotions and fit within my moral grid of what I want. If we're not trying to
Yeah.
create right and wrong ourselves.
Right. Right.
That was excellent feedback. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
There's another one here, also feedback on pets. And we also talked about deputation in that episode.
Yes.
This one, why don't you read this one?
Actually, I want to. There was one other one, and I can't find it. Maybe it's is it this one? One of maybe it was by text. Somebody else had responded that they had an example of loving a pet to an extreme. Is that this one?
Is it, are you talking about the one where, or maybe I mentioned it in the episode, there
where
was
the
a guy
wife developed allergies?
Yes, and he kicked his wife out.
Yes, and I'm sorry, that was not funny. He his wife he had his wife move out until the pet dies.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that amazing? And our listeners are going, no way. But that somebody wrote that in, that he knows of a person, that scenario. Of course, it sickened him, but where the pet meant so much, that we were going to keep the pet, and for now displace the wife until the pet would die, I guess, and then the wife could come back, since she has allergies. Amazing.
Yep.
Wow.
Crazy.
Okay, so which one am I reading here?
This one here is from Daniel. Feedback
This
on the pet loving / deputation episode.
Okay, good. And I do want to. Is this one regarding the pet loving? I recently yes. Okay, that's the one. That's the one that we were just talking about. They plan to live apart until the dog dies. Now,
that's it.
Regarding deputation, you want me to get into that?
Sure, that's kind of the next thing we got feedback on.
Yes, and I love this because I thought, honestly, now I'm a list guy, and so I like to see things written down. But I thought we started getting a bit of feedback here about the pros of deputation. I really appreciate that. And what I would like to do is even start a list of like a user compiled list of the pros and cons that people have seen. And what we're seeing, the feedback we're getting is people who have been on deputation, or they've been a child of someone on deputation. So they've actually been in it. They've experienced it. Not just that they're looking at it from a distance, but they're looking at deputation and saying, "Hey, from what I've seen and experienced, this is the good." So this one says, regarding deputation, I wanted to point out some positives that you may or may not have thought of. I grew up as a missionary kid, so I experienced deputation as a 12-year-old boy. But not as the missionary. I believe deputation is something the Lord uses for good in many churches and missionaries' lives. I believe God uses deputation to send his best preachers into churches all over the country. Neat way to put it. I have experienced this in two ways. One, as a young boy, seeing God work in mighty ways in many churches through my dad's preaching. That's a neat testimony. And two, as a church member in 2015, when a church planner named Thomas Balsamo came to my church on deputation in Maine. I can still vividly recall the message you preached on balance, using the life of Christ as an example. That has impacted my life greatly. That is also how I met you and consequently became a patron of the podcast shortly after it started. And he says, I would be interested to know how many other patrons and listeners you have as a result of your deputation. Interesting. But to say that, he's seen God work in churches. He knows that your preaching worked in his life, which was obviously directly a result of the deputation process, that you traveled to his church and came and presented something and preached for them. And that is, um, just that fact alone, that a church, children in a church get to see a real live missionary.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a man who's actually going to another country. He's actually going
Sure.
to some other part of the world, and he's showing pictures of what that's like, and he's going to do it. Um,
Yeah.
to say this actually happens. This is real, and this is a real person. Not oh yeah. When I was 18, I figured out that our church gives money to some group out there, and there's people called missionaries that go. No, we actually saw him in our church. We talked to him. We had him over for
Yeah.
a meal. That's a good thing, and that
Yeah.
was a blessing that your preaching had worked in his life that way.
Amen. Yeah.
So that was
Um,
one of the feedback that he had seen, the preaching of his own dad. What else did we see?
yeah. Well, we got some feedback on the patron message board as well, which was a buzz this week. There was
Yeah.
quite a lot of activity there about not only the subject of deputation, but also Blur's Day, the subject we talked about last time.
Yes.
A lot of activity on the message board this week because of that. If you, by the way, patreon.com/reason together, if you'd like to participate in that conversation. But
Yeah.
this is from Nathan, who is actually on deputation right now.
Right. Yes.
And it's a longer email, so I'll kind of buzz through it here. But he says, of course, there are pros and cons to it. The con being it's highly inefficient. You spend a lot of money to travel around the country, and the majority of those churches will never be heard from again. However, he says there's some great benefits, which allows the missionary to be in full-time ministry as he prepares for the field. If all one had to do to become a missionary was to fill out an application and be approved and fully financed, he would miss the ministry experience that is gained from deputation, and this would also allow many more missionaries to go to the field without having gone through any difficult testing experience to prepare them for it, like deputation would. I have some thoughts on this that
Okay.
might a little bit push back on this.
Okay. You don't
'Cause,
feel it's quite the testing ground that.
I do not.
Okay.
No. As far as the relationship between deputation and actual ministry,
Yeah.
when you bear the responsibility and the burden of it, and you see the same people all the time, and you're the face of the ministry that they know, and it kind of comes down on your shoulders if you mess things up, and all of this, there's not a lot of relationship between deputation and actual, ministry work. Now, I mean, yeah, you get experience preaching. That's good.
Right.
But the actual ministry, that's kind of a smallish part
Oh yeah.
of
But
what you're actually doing.
but what
Additionally,
part
I
of
was
what
going to
he's
say,
go ahead.
go ahead. Okay. We'll play table tennis with words here. But part of it too is that when you're on deputation, you're in someone else's ministry.
Mhm.
You don't see those people ever again, and you're not really bearing the responsibility of that work. And really, if you're going to go into, say, like, if you're going to become a revivalist, then yeah, deputation is a great experience for that. If you're going to be like a mission board director who goes around raising money for mission boards, yeah, deputation is a good experience for that. But as far as actually being in the ministry, planting a church, whether it be stateside or somewhere else in the world, there's not a lot of ministry relationship between those two things. Now, if you're saying, okay, deputation teaches you how to improvise, how to make do with what you have, how to kind of survive sleeping in places that aren't always up to par.
How to
Then
discipline
yeah,
your children when you're traveling around the countryside and always in front of people.
that's a
Yes.
big deal. That's a big deal. Now, is that what you'd call ministry experience? No, I'd say that's life experience that really you ought to have before you go into deputation anyway. And deputation kind of helps hone those things. It makes you tougher when it comes to practical things.
But in
To say that's ministry experience, I think is a little bit of a reach.
a little bit, I mean, there's a little bit, like you say, there is the preaching, and there is some sort of administrative elements of it. You have to interact with people, you have to make calls, you have to follow a
Keep a
schedule, you have
schedule.
to.
Yep.
So there is some of that, I think. And what he's also comparing that to is, what if the possibility existed that I walk into the dean of ministry placement's office and I fill out I fill out an application and they go, yep, you've graduated, kept up good grades, you can be a missionary, you're fully funded. Boom.
Yeah.
Well, that kid could be green, he could be immature, he could be unspiritual.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just sort of the testing ground of going around. Now, as you were talking, I did think about sometimes an element in and of itself isn't bad, and yet it seems like it could have a negative side to it.
Yes.
So give me your thought on this. One is um, the interaction with other pastors. The negative side of that I've heard from a missionary is that it seemed like, church after church that he went into, they would have their soapbox issue. It
Hmm.
wasn't, are you doctrinally sound? Do you want to do the work? Do you have a good
Yep.
spirit? It was, what do you believe about this issue that's big deal to us?
Yep.
And the classic manifestation of that, which just is kind of half crazy, and yet I joke about it, is the famous missionary questionnaire. And by the way, if you're a missionary and you get a questionnaire, please feel free to forward that to me at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. I would like to collect some of them, particularly if you find
Yes.
an egregious or stupid one. I would like to see that. But the question, what does your wife wear to bed?
Hmm.
Because we are like to the nth degree on clothing that you have to follow our standard, even in your own bedroom. And so, of course, the answer to that is none of your business. But you
Right.
probably won't get supported by that church. But
You're
um,
better off.
yes, truly, truly. Um, but with the interaction with pastors, that can be a negative. And yet, can't that be a positive? Because part of that ministry experience, as he was talking about, if I could put it that way, of having to interact with other leaders and other men and men who have already,
Sure.
maybe number one, recognizing their experience and their wisdom and not just like, telling them all of what
Sure.
but also learning to work with different personalities. Okay, so you're a reserved guy and you go in and there's this real, rambunctious guy and he's asking you all these questions like, what are you gonna do about this? And what about this? And what about this? And,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're like, I need time to process.
Yeah.
Wasn't that a good opportunity right there that wouldn't have been had
Sure.
if you just went to the field?
But I mean, everything you're describing is called life experience, right? That you don't need deputation to get, right? You can get life experience with different personalities working a job. You can learn how to make a
Somewhat.
schedule working a job. You
Yeah.
can learn how to discipline yourself working a job. Um, these are things people should know before they become a missionary, right? And
Well, yes.
deputation kind of weeds out those who don't already have
Who
that.
don't have it? Yes.
Right, and
So.
which that is a practical function of deputation.
Mhm.
But I'm talking about the difference between life experience versus ministry experience. And what ministry experience to me seems to be most is bearing the responsibility of the stewardship of souls.
Mhm.
You're doing that. Now, you're not, I mean, you're not God. I'm not saying you're a demigod of some sort, but you are bearing the responsibility. You're feeding people the word of God. And if you don't get it right, these people will see you again Wednesday night and then Sunday. And then the next time you're over their house visiting them, you have to get it right. And they're going to get mad at you sometimes and they're going to leave and you're going to grieve. And then
Mhm.
other people will come. They're going to have disagreements with you. You're going to have to know what you stand for and all of these other things. And you're the guy that is the face of that work. Whereas when you're on deputation, somebody else is the face of that work,
Mhm.
right? It's to me, ministry is the responsible part. It's the responsibility of that task. Where when you're on deputation, you're not bearing it yet. You're preparing to bear it,
I see
right?
what you're saying
I
as
would
you're.
say I would say the closest relationship between deputation and an actual ministry is learning to live by faith.
Mm.
Again, is that ministry work? No, in some ways that's life work,
Right,
right? I
right. I
mean,
mean, because a lot of
people,
ministry is life. You do ministry in life, and so there's a
right.
maturing process along with that responsibility.
Well, what I mean is people outside the ministry have to learn to live by faith too,
Right, sure.
right? But what's different about ministry that's not the same as all these other things that are what I call life experience or life work is that in ministry you're bearing the responsibility of the stewardship of people's souls in a leadership role that God will hold accountable for that, right? That's not what you're doing on deputation yet. somebody else is doing that and you're visiting those places. But when you're on deputation, you're living on the free will offerings of God's people. And
Hmm.
sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. When we went out on deputation, we had one supporting church, and that was the church that we were sent by. Um, and you have to learn to trust the process and, more
Hmm.
importantly, trust the Lord that he will take care of you in the process.
Hmm.
And that is good ministry experience. So I would say that's as close to it being related to ministry as it can be, because when you get to the actual ministry work, you are living by faith financially. There are these works that are supporting you.
Now, along those lines, the other thought that came to my mind that seems to could have a positive and negative side here, and I'm look for your feedback, but also those of our listeners. Anything that this kind of triggers in your mind to say, here's another thought, or here's what I think about that. Send us your thoughts. reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. Is the idea of deputation is, it's typically said we need your prayer, and certainly we all need prayer, but it does seem to be sort of at the root level, we do need financial support. That's how we're getting to the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am raising funds by presenting my work and partnering with you financially to go over to the field. My question is, when it comes to the strategic part, the strategy of deputation, uh, I don't think that that's inherently wrong, because as believers we should be wise as serpents. We ought to have,
Mm-hmm.
what man intending to go to battle doesn't first sit down and see what, he plans out and he tries to be wise. So I know there's different strategies to deputation, maybe how you schedule your meetings in certain locales at certain times, how maybe you're proactive about like studying churches, and that's not researching, where does a church stand? What are they like? Getting recommendations to say these are
Mm-hmm.
like-minded people, as opposed
Yeah.
to just like, and any church that'll have me in, I'll do that. So there's a different strategy, and yet I think the negative can be when we begin to leave the Lord out of the strategy, and it's all about strategy. And it's how can
Mm-hmm.
I my work the plan, and
Yeah.
I do the plan and I get the money and I do the
Yep.
thing, because that can carry right over into ministry of I go to the field and I work the plan.
Well,
Well, wait,
is that not just an outgrowth of the fundamentalist culture anyway?
what's that?
That is it uses practical and pragmatic means to do a spiritual thing.
Well, and sometimes can't they?
It just
Don't they?
translates
Aren't
in
they interrelated? I mean,
that. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Someone who believes they can just win more souls with the law of averages by knocking on more doors,
mm, mm,
that same person is going to take that same mentality into deputation.
yeah.
And unfortunately, that mentality permeates through fundamentalist culture until you end up with these big missions conferences where the majority of the support goes to the best actors.
Well, yeah, and that can be a problem. Now, I'm honestly a little pushback, as I don't think this pragmatism is certainly confined to fundamentalism.
Yeah,
You
true.
know, but um,
That's fair.
yes, like you say, so now if I have the smoothest presentation,
Hmm.
I show the most compelling pictures and video. I do a certain way now. Now the church goes, oh wow, well they're really nice, or they're sweet, or he really did a good job. And oftentimes they have a shallow view of what good preaching is or what a good
Hmm.
presentation is, and maybe honestly they've even sort of misperceived what their actual role as a church is and what deputation is.
Yeah.
Are we do we want to partner with this man and deputize him to be our representative on the field?
Yeah.
And he may be a good guy, and it may be a valid ministry, but maybe
Right.
he's not the one that we're supposed to partner with. But anyway,
Well,
um,
I've told you the story before. You've laughed about this, where we were at, excuse me, we're at this one missions conference of a very big church, and the pastor, very, very well-known guy, I guess, in his circuit. And,
right, and
they,
quite a circuit.
sure, sure. And because of the pragmatic mentality of a lot of the missionaries there, it created this fleshly spirit of competition. And I'm not about that. Now, I am naturally a competitive person, but there are times where my competitive side just shuts down out of disgust.
Yeah.
this was one of those
Because, I mean, in
cases.
truth, you could
So
take down every one of those missionaries. He's like, let me show you a little Krav Maga. Okay.
humble you a little bit. But no, I mean, the sycophantic way in which they would trail behind the pastor of the church and try and schmooze him and try and ingratiate themselves to him,
Yeah.
it was disgusting. And I kept my distance from that. I mean, I remember telling my
understand.
wife, I don't care if they choose not to support us at this point. I don't care.
Right.
And I kept my distance from the pastor because I'm not going to compete with these other guys like some sycophant, right? And by the end of the week, I'd hardly spoken with the pastor at all. And we get to this restaurant after the conference, kind of a celebratory thing to the end of the conference. And the pastor, it just kind of, there's only one seat left and it's right across from me. And he sits down and he's looking at me and he just pauses and he tweaks his head to the side a little bit. And he says, "So what's our connection?" which was a polite way of saying, "How do I know you? Like, how did you end up at our
How
conference?"
did you end?
Right. So it was, yeah, and that's the thing, this sort of
I'm the
pragmatic
cousin to your
view.
secretary's postman. There's a last minute cancellation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I slipped in there.
No. But this pragmatic view in of ministry bleeds out into this pragmatic view of deputation, where the best salesmen and the best actors get the support. And it takes a mature church to see someone who is truly called of God, who will stick with the work that they've been sent to. I praise the Lord that a lot of the churches we ended up in were not like that one I described a moment ago. They were mature churches. They were gracious churches and loyal, faithful churches that could look beyond the the ability of a guy to sell and act and actually support someone.
And yet, in some ways, there obviously is a strategy to deputation that makes more sense, or is more practical, or is more, useful. So, yeah, that's the plus and the minus there of one thing that's not necessarily good or bad, but it's the way that we approach it, whether it's spiritually or carnally, that can really make a difference and look vastly different between two different missionaries. So, anyway,
good.
Yeah.
Well, we've got to move to the next subject here because I'd like to try and squeeze this in.
Okay. We've only got a few minutes.
We've got a few minutes. I'm okay with going a few minutes over if you are.
Okay.
Just so we can squeeze in this feedback here, because we talked about the Blur's Day article. And there was some feedback here that I thought was very, that's what I'm looking for. I don't know. It kind of almost shut down the need for the article. I could say, if I could say that. So those of you that listened to the last episode might remember when we talked about Blur's Day, the article that we shared about Satan perhaps preparing the world for the idea of the Antichrist, right?
Yes.
Kind of conditioning is the word that we used.
And the Blur's Day was basically saying that days don't really matter anymore because everything just blurs together, and that's sort of paving the way for eliminating Sunday. Am I correct?
Correct, yes. Okay. And the article talked about the sexagesimal system, which is base 60, though technically the article said base 6 and made the arguments based on a base 6, which I think was maybe not accurate, but
misleading.
Yeah, misleading perhaps. I don't know that it was intentional, but misleading. But some of our feedback on this was from our patrons here. One patron says, "It's interesting to note that if it's true that the Babylonian calendar was based on a sexagesimal system of base 60, then from the perspective of Daniel and his original audience, Daniel 7:25, where it says changing of times, was fulfilled when the world left the sexagesimal system."
Right.
And it's like, that just drops the whole article. It's yeah.
Crickets.
Sure. Yeah, crickets. In many ways, it undermines the point of the article. Another patron, our same patron actually notes here, this is from Omar, says, it's also worth noting that he shall think to change times and laws does not necessarily mean he's changing the calendar. Many
Right.
theologians believe that this phrase is a reference to eliminating religious holidays and religious laws, which um, I don't know if it's in this feedback, but Omar basically goes on to say that that is a common tactic of tyrannical leaders. um, yeah, so I thought that was a very interesting insight to it. And this one here, this one kind of hurts a little from this patron. This one says, "Oh, and I thought it was funny that the author of that article thinks it would appease everyone to get rid of Sundays, even without counting the huge global population of practicing and nominal Christians who would be upset. All heathens would be very upset as well. Apparently, it's been a while since the author." Redacted here, though you can know who it is if you read the show notes
Yeah.
in the last episode. He says, apparently it's been a while since the author has worked in the secular world, or else he would know that even the non-religious people live for the weekend. The only reason
Right.
many...
If you took one of their weekend days, like what?
Yeah. He says, no, I don't think getting rid of Sundays would appease very many people. In fact, it would probably start another world war. Ha ha. So these are all very good points that essentially draw out kind of the, I don't know, it almost makes the article unnecessary in some ways, and perhaps erroneous. But I thought that was good feedback
Good.
On that.
Yep.
So
Yep.
there
Thank
was
you.
more feedback on that. We might have to, I don't know, should we take that into the after show? That was on the main episode last time. We can
Yeah,
actually, we can
yeah,
just do it in the next episode. We'll
yeah,
just bring in some more
that's
feedback
fine.
on
Yeah,
that
because
because
we still didn't cover really all the feedback we had, but that's great.
no.
To handle that. Just love that there's a buzz there and some conversation. Thank you guys and patrons. And again, what Tom was referencing earlier is that there is a patron only message board on patreon.com. So if that's something you'd like to be a part of, you can sign up to be a subscriber at patreon.com/reason together. And then you can discuss comments back and forth just amongst the patrons themselves. Otherwise,
Yes.
send us your thoughts at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes. Thank you for being with us on this episode. We're going to head over to the after show now, but for now, we are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.